Steven, are you okay with us recording this session?
Of course I am. In fact, a lot of people have asked about that because for one reason or another, just personal commitments, they won't be able to make it to watch the session live.
Sure, yeah, we'll record it and share it, and then Teresa, you have his contact information, so when we post it, you can share with Steven the link. You can share it too.
Yeah. She could also post it in her Facebook posts too.
Yes, please post it in your Facebook post, Teresa. I agree.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you, Stevan, for joining us today. Just one second.
Thank you for having me.
Stevan, for those of you who didn't get the chance to read the post on Kannon2's website, is a native of Denver, Colorado, and he has been living in DC for 25 years, right, Stevan?
Correct.
25 years working for the World Bank, even though today he's not here representing the World Bank in any way. He's just here to share his personal story with us. I connected with Stevan recently after the death of George Floyd, and he told me that what happened, the recent events in the country, had a huge impact on him, and he has been finding his voice to speak against racism. So he welcomed the invitation to talk with us today, and he hopes the conversation today will open a dialogue to confront racism and to make progress as a society. So, Stevan, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So thanks, Teresa, for inviting me into the Online Buddhism Society for making this happen. And thank you for the introduction because it's really important to me. One thing that I wanted to say to start off, kind of a thought, is that my experience with racism is broad and deep, and it's something that I have had to grapple with and face on a daily basis. However, as Teresa had said, the recent events culminating in the murder of George Floyd really brought to the fore my personal feelings and has been kind of a pivotal moment in my evolution and how I am choosing to face it, and also to hopefully be the type of person and a catalyst in the world that I would like to see. So I'm going to talk today, focus mainly on my experience, and then I'm going to talk about why I selected some of the readings that I did. And then at the end, I'm going to discuss a few ideas for ways forward, and I would like for the Q&A to focus on the personal experiences that each and every one of you have had with this, as well as some key cogent questions that I wanted to, I guess, help frame the discussion. So as I said, my experience with racism is broad and deep. I grew up in South Lakewood, Colorado, just west of Denver. However, I was born in Denver. My first experience with racism occurred in preschool at the age of 5. One of my classmates named Laura at St. Mary's Academy in Cherry Hills, which is probably the most affluent neighborhood in Colorado. It's a Catholic private school with nuns for teachers, invited me and kids in my preschool class to her birthday party, only to come to school the next day to disinvite me because her mother had sent her to tell me that it would be inappropriate for me to attend because I'm Black. I remember the discussion I had with my mom after that, and the recognition as like a 5-year-old thinking, oh, okay, what's this about? Then moving on a little bit later, my parents divorced when I was in 3rd grade. I was at St. Mary's through 3rd grade. they took my brother and I out of private school, and then I went to, we lived in Jefferson County in South Lakewood. So it was kind of a big shock for me, you know, what was going on in my own household, but then also to go from private school, which was very different than public school. Although my parents had relocated to the suburbs precisely in case they wanted to avoid the issue of busing that was very prevalent in the 70s. So my first day of 4th grade, a classmate named Kevin Raymer started laughing uncontrollably when he saw me, and because he couldn't get over the fact that I have a red tongue and that my teeth were white. And he was just laughing, just uncontrollably. And I remember feeling like a circus animal. I remember feeling ashamed. I remember feeling like I didn't know what to do, what to think, what to say. And he had never seen a Black person and didn't realize that it was possible for a Black person to have a red tongue. That was my first experience in Jefferson County schools at Westgate Elementary. So that was a huge shock for me. Later that same year, a classmate who had moved to Colorado from Georgia, his name is Richard White. And what's funny about when I went back to recall all these stories is that I could remember them like they were yesterday, you know, I can remember so many vivid details. But Richard, he lived in the same neighborhood, and he called me the N-word one day on the bus. So I hit him. We got in a fight, and yet I was the only one who ended up getting in trouble. And in those days, they called it a deform, which meant that I could no longer ride the bus to school and that my mom had to drive me to school. The next day, I asked Richard why he didn't get one, and he said that where he comes from, that's the way it's supposed to be. And he's white, I'm Black, and his mother simply just called the principal and told the school that it was my fault, and that was it. So my mom did drive me to school for the rest of that week. One day in high school, everyone went to a park across from Westgate Elementary to drink and hang out, and suddenly it was apparently after dark and we weren't supposed to be there, and the cops closed in on the crowd and everyone dispersed. I was one of 2 people who got caught, 1 or 2 or 3 people, partially because my car was in the parking lot, and but then yet I was the only one that I can recall, I will stand corrected if it's not true, that actually got a citation to go to court, and definitely the only one that I know of that had to do community service. So, you know, that was the first time that my mom gave me the talk about being Black in a white society, in a mainly white area, and trying not to stand out and to be aware that I will always be judged more harshly than the people I'm with. And I remember her thinking to myself, well, how is that possible? I'm just a human being. I'm just like everybody else. And she said, I remember her telling me that in life, I would always need to be better just to be treated the same in work, in school, and everything else. And I remember thinking that seemed like an impossible ideal to live up to, but she told me that nevertheless. Of these few cases is what in one of the readings I want to get to later, that John Rice in the Atlantic describes as racism in the first degree. Basically meaning the systemic racism that is like calling the N-word. And what I've come to learn is more about the fact that institutional isn't an individual thing, but it's institutional. And when it's institutional, that's when it becomes oppressive. And that's when it becomes this albatross that it's hard for any of us to remove from our necks. So anyway, also the same year that happened, you know, is when I was in 4th grade. I was the only student in all of the 4th grade that wasn't considered to be a special person. And I remember why that was weird. I was the only Black kid in the class. And I remember how hurt I was. And every week there were two teachers. They would select two students for either their scholastic ability or because they behaved well or whatever. And on the last day of class, one of my good friends named Chris Herod, actually, I remember him the last few days of class for the year, he kept saying, well, what about Stevan? And they would go, no, no. And then I remember at the last day of school, when I was the only one selected, I asked my mom if I was special. And she was like, why would you ask that? Of course you're special. Of course, like every mom would tell their kid, you know. And I told her what happened. And I remember a tear coming up in her eye. And I can remember it like it was yesterday, even though it was like 40 some odd years ago. You know, she just proceeded to tell me that that wasn't true, and that, you know, obviously I am special and not to worry about it. But I could see that that hurt her as well. In high school, you know, another situation, I'm the only Black kid among a group of friends when sharing drinks in the presence of others. And I remember one of my friends talked about nigger lipping a bottle. And even though I object, they continue to use the phrase. And I remember a term like nigger knocking, when you would go and ring a doorbell and leave and just do kind of goofy things that kids do. And remember being not only powerless over being able to, not even having the vocabulary to learn how to deal with that or how to address it. And these are lifelong friends that, you know, I know and love. And, you know, but I realized, and in the reading, one of the readings I selected as being a token Black friend, I never felt like a token Black friend. I've always felt like someone who had genuine and deep and loving relationships with all of my friends. But I realized in some of these cases that I was complicit in that behavior by not speaking up and allowing it to happen. And that's one of the fundamental changes that I'm seeing in myself today. Another one of my experiences in high school, I drove to pick up a classmate named Kelly at her house. And my parents did very well for themselves. And we lived in a very nice neighborhood. And I remember going to another neighborhood and wasn't as nice, but I remember thinking, okay. And then so as I pulled up, she came running out of the house crying hysterically with her father nipping at her heels. And, you know, when on the driveway, her father yells, pointing his finger, saying, you better tell him, you better tell him. And, you know, Kelly gets in the car. I ask her what's wrong. And she tells me that her parents forbid her from hanging out with me because I'm Black. There was no romantic anything, but even if there was, they still forbid it. And as soon as her father walked in the house, Kelly asked me to drive off. So I drove to a friend's house in a neighborhood called Willowbrook. And so she could call her parents to let them know I was okay. And I actually think now, God, that was really smart, because if they had called the police, I wonder what would have happened. But that was pre-cell phone. So in college, I rushed a white fraternity, and one year at a dinner dance, it was up in a posh resort up in the Rocky Mountains, and, you know, kind of a rite of passage. And my girlfriend at the time, Megan, who's white, said, you know, that, you know, we were just having dinner and everything. And then when it comes time for the check, the waitress brings a check, and she wrote N plus W to identify us as a couple. And instead of actually asking us our names like she did everybody else. In the early days of college, I met a group of non-fraternity friends in the dorm. It's kind of everybody's still getting to know each other. And we go on a pub crawl, and we end up at a party off campus. And one of my white friends who had several drinks suddenly expresses surprise at how articulately that I speak. And ask where I'm from, because people from, you know, where he's from, Black people don't sound like me. Almost as if it's not possible. And I remember thinking, okay, that was interesting. And when I was in college, my mom moved to Nashville, and several of my friends and neighbors said, well, why would she do that? This people mainly in Colorado, and they say it's so racist and backward there. And you know, I remember telling my mom that, and I shared the story, and several of my friends on the call will relate to this. But she said, my mom's reply was, well, at least in Nashville, I know where I stand, because the racism and things are more. She knew how to operate in that environment because she was from the South, even though she grew up in Ohio. And today, so I don't know if I even told you this story, but after college, I moved to Tarragona, Catalonia, just south of Barcelona, to teach English and play football. And it turns out that I wasn't that good at football, but I had a blast partying and meeting lifelong friends and having a blast. And one night, not too far from there, there's another resort town called Solo on the Golden Coast, and you know, where the young go and hang out and party and everything all night, beach area. And we had been out most of the night, and we were, you know, having fun, didn't want to go home. And so one of my friends takes me, we go to an after hours party at another club that neither of us had ever been to. So I'm standing there, and I remember this like it was yesterday. I had quite a bit to drink, and I remember standing there, and suddenly this guy, I could just feel like the hatred. You could just feel it. It's like it's tension. Or like as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar noted in his LA Times op-ed that I posted, it's almost like you can't detect it until some sunlight is shown on it, the racism, but I could feel the tension. And this guy was standing right next to me. And then I noticed some of his friends are kind of getting in place. And then suddenly this guy stands right in front of me, and he's so close that I could feel his breath on me. And my friend who I was with was kind of like trying to hook up with some girl. And then out of the clear blue, this guy just smacks me in the face and almost breaks my nose. And this is in Spain, this isn't in the US. And I remember why that was so impactful to me, because first of all, what happened was my friend wanted to start a fight. I had never actually been in a fight. And so I de-escalated the situation quickly, because I remember thinking to myself, there are 5 other guys here. There are only 2 of us. And it almost felt like a setup. So what was interesting is my friend walks me to the bathroom, and the bouncer did too. And I'm cleaning up my bloody nose with tissues. And in Spanish, you know, we're talking, and the bouncer tells me, he says, you know, this isn't a good place for people like you. And it's probably best if you leave. And we left. So that was one of my experiences outside of this country. Luckily, a friend in the area's father was a doctor, examined my nose, and it wasn't broken, but it was bruised, and that still leaves scars on that experience. So I'm almost done talking about my personal experience, but I think it's important to identify racism and try to give people the look and feel of not only what it looks like, but what kind of impact it can have on people. And so I will tell a story that I did share with some colleagues at the World Bank. For those of you who don't know, it's a global international development agency. And, you know, about 8 to 10 years ago, you know, I hear a few colleagues talking, so I walk up to join the conversation. I step away for a few seconds, and I come back, and I overheard one of my colleagues who has 2 advanced degrees from Ivy League universities say, there are no good Black communications people in the World Bank. Just so cavalierly, like the sky is blue or the grass is green. And I remember immediately thinking, wow, like, what was that about? And then thinking, well, how should I react? Should I say something? Should I do something? And I remember it being kind of like a poison pill that I ended up having to swallow and digest. And I went into my office and I closed the door. And I remember the impact it had on me was profound, because for several years, every time I was late on assignment or felt like I could have done better, I always saw it through the lens of my race instead of my ability. So the impact that had on me is that I remember being hesitant to do certain things in the work environment, and through a lot of self-reflection and doing kind of a rigorous personal inventory, I came to believe and realize that my own experience and resentments, these kind of resentments, were actually doing me a lot of harm. And so I had to find a way to figure out how to deal with them. And what's interesting, of these lists of resentments that I went through, I noticed that about a third of them had to do with racism. And that I, as a person, they were going to hold me back from being as good as I wanted to be. So I mentioned this story because in one of the readings by, I think it was John Rice in The Atlantic, where it talks about first and third degree racism. This is an example of what I think he describes as third degree racism, which is akin to aiding and abetting or manslaughter. It's kind of the kind of thing that is designed to kind of kill aspirations of people. And it was just so matter of fact and cavalier that it felt like, just commonplace. And I regret not saying anything now, and I want to be very clear that this is not kind of a regular experience that I've had in employment, but I have other examples that I could share, and I just thought it would be good and poignant to share at least one of them. And just to let you know, for the first time in 15 years, I got a promotion recently. And before that, it just actually happened in February this year, that before applying, I thought about not applying, because outside of the Africa region, there were only 4 Black people in my profession doing what I do at the level or above that I was applying for. And at that time, and I remember thinking, well, I won't get it anyway, because 2 of those Black people actually worked for Black vice presidents. And after talking to some people, they said, no, you got to apply. I ended up getting it through a highly competitive process. I prepared my you-know-what off like I've never done, and I got the job. And I think to myself, thank God I didn't listen, and thank God I don't believe that anymore. In August of 2017, there was this Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and that was a kind of an uncomfortable situation where the first time that with my partner and his family who lives in that area, most of them live in that area, had to have some difficult conversations with people I love about Confederate monuments and whether they should be removed or not. And conversations not going exactly the way I'd want them to go, despite me knowing that they're not racist. So this kind of led me to read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which is a New York Times bestseller, about why it's so difficult to talk about racism with white people. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's a page turner. And I learned a lot about it and her rigorous analysis of why people are so uncomfortable with it. I'm uncomfortable talking to you about it right now, and I live it every day. But for those of us, I think, in society, Black, white, brown, Asian, whatever, the purpose of this conversation is really to get comfortable being uncomfortable, and only then can we make progress. So I think I've given plenty of examples of my personal experience, and there are others that I may weave into the Q&A, but I guess I wanted to just really focus right now on the fact that these experiences have had an accumulative effect on me. And in a quest for personal growth and going through the arduous journey of taking the expansive inventory, I've had to change my life in a way that I could live with intention and in patient optimism. And I say it that way because I can no longer live in fear or with anxiety of what the impact of racism has on me personally, or on society. So I can't do it anymore. And this, all of these experiences is at least my experience about being Black in America. I by no means am the spokesperson for Black people. You should talk to your friends and neighbors and family to learn about their own personal experience, because people have had varied experiences for very, very different reasons. But to be Black in America is to be told over and over that you're not good enough, that you don't belong, and that you're genetically unfit and your physical presence is undesirable. And that's a sad fact, but to make progress and to be able to move forward as a society, I think we need to address what systemic racism does in our society. And as John Rice talks about, first, second, and third degree racism, that actually holds racism in place. And that's one of the things that Robin DiAngelo addresses in her book. But despite all of these experiences, I love my country, I love my state, I love my friends, I love my family. And part of the reason why I want to have this in-depth discussion with all of you today is first to face my fears and anxiety and express and share my story so that others can glean something from that. And that, despite all of this, I wouldn't choose to be anything but a Black American. And I say the term Black because I grew up as Black, not as African American. So I'm fine with both, but that's just my personal preference. And to do the homework on my own, to read books. I'm starting with James Baldwin that I got for my birthday. Actually, that just took place earlier this week. And I look forward to reading other books about acquainting myself with history. And I say history because it's not just Black history, it's history. And learning all of the things about what my brothers and sisters have accomplished in this country, and that our fundamental contribution to build this country from slavery on to the present day has always had a tremendous and fundamental impact on this country and in the world, for that matter. One of the most interesting things that helped me come to this revelation is I thought, because my parents made 6 digits in the 70s, and that I work at the World Bank, and that I have an education, that I live in a nice place, that somehow that gave me some level of privilege. But with the events of George Floyd and others that have taken place that sparked the protests, I realized that, I don't think I really have as much privilege as I thought. And I need to do my best to be the change that I want to see in the world. And I just think about the fact that I don't have to worry about my next meal, but I wonder what it must be like for a Black person in this country who didn't have my level of privilege. I do have some level. I guess at this point, because we're coming up on close to 30 minutes, I just wanted to delve really quickly into why I selected the readings that I did. I selected the difference between first degree racism and third degree racism by John Rice, because only when people align on what racist behavior looks like will we be able to take practical steps to make those behaviors costly. And I also chose it because it's central to the argument that we must increase the cost of racist behavior, whatever the type. And we also, doing so, as he said, would create the conditions for Black people to harness the economic power essential to changing the narrative in white America's mind about race. I chose the video on systemic racism explained because it was very educational for me. When my parents lived in Denver in Park Hill, which was a predominantly Black neighborhood, and then moved to predominantly white suburbs, that the connection of them wanting a better life for their kids, and because of the school system wanting to ensure that they could do that, and since they had the financial means to do so, that they did so. But that yet, even with all of that, there's still kind of a deck stacked against you as a Black American in terms of all of the other aspects, whether it's police or whether it's education or housing, that can prevent Black Americans from really living the American dream. I selected Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's LA Times op-ed because it was, when I read that piece, that was what actually led me to change my profile pic to Black Lives Matter. I remember being fearful of what my friends in Colorado would think if I did that. Would it spark from people that were not in favor of the movement or had doubts of it? I remember thinking of being worried about that. I worried about my employer thinking, oh, is this taking a political stance? And I thought that's reading his op-ed really connected me with my values and what I feel and stand for as a person. And I realized that at a certain point, it doesn't matter, because every individual needs to be true to themselves to be the best person that they can be. And for me, this is something that I've really had to confront. And racism is something that I've had to deal with my entire life, each and every day, as I said, in different ways, sometimes small, sometimes big. I selected the reading For Our White Friends Desiring to Be Allies because I really like how she breaks down 6 points and how people who want to lend a hand can be helpful. Her most important point is, for me, I think was point 5, which is ask when you don't know, but do the homework first. So I think one of today's Facebook commenters said, yeah, but don't make him do the work. I'm happy to do the work because I think all of us need to do the work, but absolutely, please do the reading yourself. Read about history, watch movies, go see Selma, see I'm Not Your Negro, which is a documentary about James Baldwin. Watch some of the other plays and things and educate yourself. And then ask the questions with an educated standpoint. The New Yorker article on white fragility is a perfect introduction to Robin DiAngelo, who's white, and her poignant analysis of why talking about racism is so difficult. And it taught me a lot trying to learn from the perspective of what the people I'm talking to might be going through. And so for me as a Black person, it was insightful. I'm sure that no matter what your race is, it could be insightful for you as well. And the article, Reflections from a Token Black Friend, was perhaps the most insightful for me because I grew up in Colorado. I never doubted the appreciation, love, and support of my family and friends from anywhere I've lived. But the article was insightful for me because I realized that too often I think I was complicit by not speaking out and speaking up when things made me uncomfortable. So that's something that I'm going to change in a respectful and loving way. But I think that out of just self-respect, but also respect for all of humanity and Black people, that's a necessary thing for me to do. Mainly because, and I think as Robin DiAngelo talks about, maintaining the status quo is exactly what keeps racism in place. And so I feel like something's different now. I feel like, and I think a lot of Black people feel this, that the marches and the protests and everything that's happening today, that we shouldn't have to go through this because our parents did, yet here we are. And so I'm ready to march, I'm ready to fight, I'm ready to talk, all peacefully, no vandalism, but hey, I think it's time that we have some difficult conversations. So finally, I want to talk about moving forward. And I talked to my mom, who's a clinical PhD, a clinical psychologist PhD. And I asked her for what advice I should give people dealing with their own personal experiences with racism and how to make a difference in society. And she suggested that people think of their own personal experience in relationship with racism over the years, whether it be a family member, in education, sports, employment, things that they've witnessed, and how those experiences shaped their implicit and explicit views about other people who are different from them. She also warned me not to make people feel racist, and to suggest to reflect on their personal relationship with racism, whether it's a parent, boss, grandparent, sibling, or friend. And only when we make these feelings and thoughts accessible can we deal with them individually and be the change we want to see in society. She also said to think about how things happened and how they would manage the situation differently if they were confronted with it today. So as a topic, and as I wrap up, because I've talked a lot and I really want to hear a lot about what people have to say, is if there is one, I want to pose a few questions or food for thought. I want to hear your personal reflections and reactions to the readings, and or your personal stories and issues that you've had to deal with racism, in terms of being observer or what have you. I also want to pose the question of what does it mean to move forward and to be anti-racist? Do we want to take one or a few steps forward right now? Do we tackle the whole thing? Or how do we really move forward as a society? I also want to know what all of you are doing to learn to listen instead of listening to learn, and what you are doing personally to help getting more comfortable being uncomfortable talking about these difficult topics. And finally, in terms of integrity, what do you feel you need to do personally as a bystander, even when there's no person of color, black or brown, in the room, to be able to look at yourselves in the mirror, that you did all you could to fight racism. And this is not just a fight for Black people, it's a fight for all of us. And I fundamentally believe that. And that's why I feel like this one's different. So with that, I just want to thank Teresa for inviting me. And I hope the talk was insightful. This discussion will help me live with intention and help me craft being an impatient optimist about the current state of the USA and in the world more broadly, and the recognition and acceptance that racism does exist everywhere. So thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Stevan. Thank you for your talk and for all the questions for us. So I invite anybody who has a question, please ask or to share any. Diane?
Thank you, Stevan. I found myself kind of in tears as I was, am I unmuted? I found myself in tears as I was listening to your talk. And when you talked about feeling inadequate or not good enough and all of that, I guess on a personal level, I identified with that. Obviously, I'm white, so it has nothing to do with my own race. But I think we've all felt that in some degree, and so maybe that's the beginning of compassion and empathy. In terms of my own taking steps, I'm just ready to take very little baby steps. I love the articles that you suggested. I think educating ourselves, first of all, and just moving ahead and not letting this opportunity that has presented itself to us die like so many other things. I go back to the 60s and Cesar Chavez and the Vietnam War and all the things we did in those days, and things just seem to die off and not move forward. So I'm making a pledge to continue moving forward and continuing to educate myself, and just thank you so very much.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, Dave?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your talk, Stefan. So your talk about growing up in Denver and also the article about third degree racism reminds me of a couple of things from my own childhood. I'm quite a bit older than you are, so I grew up in the 50s and 60s. In the 50s, I actually was living in Denver, and not too long ago, I went back to visit the school, the elementary school that I went to in Denver. And it's amazing, unlike California, where the school looked exactly like it did in the 1950s, because it's all just a big brick building, you know, stand the Denver winters. It looked just the same, except that the students looked very different, because I realized when I looked at the students at the school that there were Black students and Asian students and Latino students. And I commented to this nice lady who was in the school office about that. And she said, yes, isn't it great, the progress that we've made? And yes, it is, but we have to be careful not to feel kind of smug about that. Later, when I was in high school in the 60s, we had moved to California. And your mention of your mother moving from Colorado to Tennessee reminded me of a conversation that I had with a cousin from Tennessee who was visiting in California. And of course, this was the early to mid 60s, so the civil rights movement was very active. And I was kind of chiding her about what was going on in Tennessee where she lived. And she just looked at me and said, well, you just don't understand. And I said to her, well, I go to school every day with Black students, and you don't. So what is it that I don't understand about going to school with Black students? Again, I was feeling very smug about the whole thing. You know, I'd grown up with liberal Democrat parents who, you know, they were the kind of people who were so in favor of the civil rights movements that they would look at Black people and say, I don't even see their skin color. It's just the same as hair color or eye color. It doesn't matter to me, which of course is a silly, self-righteous kind of an attitude. So when I read about third degree racism, I mean, I think that's just an absolute reality. And the fact that only a few white people are running around with Confederate flags and carrying torches and all of this nonsense doesn't really in any way excuse the rest of us from our tacit participation in systemic racism and our ability to just sort of, you know, wash our hands of the whole thing. We do tisk, we look at these things on TV just the way in the 50s we used to look at, you know, Bull Connor and the police dogs on television and say, tisk, tisk, we're better than that. So we really all have to tune into our responsibilities to not just talk about this in a way that makes us feel better than those racist people, but to actually do something.
Absolutely.
Les?
Thanks for being here. I like the distinction. It helps to carry the distinction between first degree and third degree racism. But at the individual level, individuals' feeling of racism, you know, when we are very young, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7 years old, we're very vulnerable, we are naive, we are very impressionable, and we absorb what our elders tell us or what we see and hear in society. And I think a lot of individual racism comes from what other people tell us and what other people model. But when we're so young and don't have the facility to make good judgments, we're kind of not responsible. Things just happen to us. However, when we're older and we become an adult, then we have responsibility. We have responsibility to look at how we feel and how our feelings may be harmful and dangerous. And if we have a sense of fairness and of righteousness, we will make an effort to change. We don't know how to make that change because it's difficult, but if we have a sense of responsibility as an adult, we will try to change. My feeling is that many people who or have a racist feeling, absorbed it when they were children by their society or their parents or whoever. And when they become adults, they don't feel the responsibility to change because they want to remain as children. They don't want to take on the responsibility, the hard work of making the change because it requires a lot of soul searching and a lot of hard work. I wonder how you feel about, that's my perspective. And I wonder how you feel about that.
I definitely think racism is taught rather than and learned rather than a natural phenomenon. I think, and as I was talking with my mom about this, you know, to some degree, I guess we're all a product of our environment. But I think though that where I have some difficulty accepting that without any question is that we all do have some values and level of integrity. And at some point, I think as individuals, even the people that I've seen on TV talking about they're like reformed white supremacists, they have a kind of an aha moment where they say, this isn't okay. This isn't right. And they move forward to better themselves. I, on a daily basis, am thinking about how I can grow and how I can, you know, improve myself, both in whether it's academically, in my employment and my life with my partner, as a friend, you know, as a son. And I think that all of us need to do that on a regular basis. And I think, like I said, being impatiently optimistic is one way to looking at it. Living with intention is another, because I think that, as I said earlier, my fear about what that means is that we accept the status quo and that we do nothing about it. And so I think we need to, as individuals and as a collective, really think about not allowing it to be okay. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, we could talk about this a long time. I just feel that people don't want to talk about it because it's comfortable for them. The status quo is comfortable, and they don't want to shake up their comfort. And I think that's one thing that's holding back this whole discussion. People want to stay comfortable, but I don't want to.
Absolutely.
You know, I don't want to dominate this. So, but thank you for your response, and thanks again for being here.
Yeah. No, and please, thank you for your question. And depending on how we go with other questions, please come back with more.
Okay.
Bonnie?
Well, I have a question, but I saw Josh has his hand up first. So Josh, maybe you should go first. Some people are using the digital hand, so.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm in my truck with my earpiece, so, but I pulled over on the side of the road to talk to you. Thanks, Stevan. You know, as well as I know you, it was good to hear about all your experiences. I haven't heard all those, and certainly heartbreaking in some respects. But, you know, as you were talking about your mom and how she sat you down to talk to you about your race, I get to thinking about, you know, my upbringing and stuff, and I didn't have any, you know, my parents didn't have that conversation with me. I'm just wondering if with kids that are being born now, white kids, what would you say to them on how they should sit down and maybe have a talk with their kids about race?
Wow, that's a good question, Josh. I don't know if I have a good answer, but I'll do my best. First of all, I'm not a parent, so I don't know what to advise parents to tell their kids, but I would imagine that in terms of race, you want your kids to be the best people that they can be. I think the best and the most important advice that a parent could give their kids right now, and as you pointed out, as white kids especially, would be to listen, to have a diverse group of friends, and diversity in every way, in shape and form. So, and to get people to know people who are not like themselves and to appreciate those differences. I would also, like I said during the talk, to advise them to learn about history and to get their own perspective about what they feel about things, and to then ask questions when they don't fully understand, of their parents and of their friends. You know, I think that's the only way, the best way to really be able to move forward. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. You know, I just think, yeah, about my sisters that have younger kids and stuff, and I think that's important, learning about history and educating them. But even maybe even just taking a step further and have an honest sit-down discussion with them about race when they're young, to try to change this from the ground level. Yeah. I
actually have one more thought. One of my friends from Colorado actually came to visit me in Nashville, and when I worked at a historically Black college and university, I remember bringing them to a Black fraternity and sorority party, and they said, their comment to me was that I went to high school every day and dealt with that, and they felt different being the only white person there, maybe challenge themselves to get out of their comfort zone and to travel the world and to be in places that they normally wouldn't be, so that they could somehow experience what it might be like for people who are the only one of their kind. Because I think you can talk about things, but you also have to learn by doing. And I think that was something my friend shared with me that was very instrumental. A lot of the discomfort he felt, and it was obviously a safe space because he was with me, a friend, but also with very highly educated doctors and dentists and people. And but even if they weren't doctors, even if they were just regular people, people are people, you know. So
yeah, thanks. That helps a lot.
Mommy.
Oh, hi, Steven. First of all, thank you for your talk. And I'm sorry for the way people treated you. That's bullshit, all of that. And I see you as an incredibly courageous person, incredibly courageous and brilliant and beautiful and intelligent. And I want you to know that if I ever have a birthday party, you are invited. For the rest of my life, you are always invited to my birthday. So thank you.
Thanks. And I will show up. Be careful.
You better. You better.
He likes parties.
I see Carter has his hand up, and then Vanessa.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carter, and thank you, Stevan, for your, I'm gonna put it on gallery because I can't see anybody. Thank you for your talk. It's like so visceral, like everything that you were talking about. Obviously, as a Black man in America, myself, we have gone through similar yet different experiences when it comes to, you know, race and trying to traverse America as a Black man. I mean, it's like even recently we're celebrating the 4th of July. I wasn't up to it. Like, I just wasn't up to being patriarchal and given recent events. And, you know, I always struggle with, you know, this great love of this country, which I do have, but then also that PTSD from my experiences with cops and teachers and doctors and pretty much any person that is not a person of color that has crossed my path, and institutions. I can go on for a really long time. And I love that, you know, everyone is on this call and, you know, are willing to have these conversations, because I was like recently talking with a friend and we were discussing, you know, race relations, and I was like, you know, for lack of a better term, people who aren't people of color don't like being uncomfortable. And so they don't want to have these conversations, but these conversations are conversations that we need to have in order to move forward. And I love that you mentioned James Baldwin. I'm a huge fan of his, and you know, I've read a lot of his books, and I recently watched I Am Not Your Negro, and it was prolific for me. And I would highly recommend it for anybody who has time. It's on Netflix currently right now. And you know, it's hard enough being a person, just traversing life and world and fears and trying to get a foothold on your place in society, and you take all of that and you add being Black on top of it, or being a person of color on top of it, and it's sometimes it's exhausting. And I think that in order to push forward, and I love what was said about, you know, third-degree racism, and complacency and being silent, and, you know, not calling out your friends, and, you know, not holding people. If you're in a room full of people and someone's being racist and there's not a POC in the room, hold that person accountable. And I love that, you know, I think it takes, because none of us, I mean, we're a society and a people who we have to have a society. We have to have, you know, people in order, that's how we survive. And nobody wants to go against the grain. Nobody wants to be outside of their comfort zone. Nobody wants to be outside of the group's comfort zone. And I think it's very important that we, you know, a part of showing empathy and compassion is to call out those folks who need to be called out, and have those conversations with those people in a very, you know, compassionate way, if that's possible. And even walking away from situations and coming back and revisiting these situations with people. I remember when you talked about how your mom had to have that conversation with you about your race and how the world looks at you. And it's just something that every Black parent has to have that conversation with their child at one point or another, especially if you're a Black man in this country, and especially given recent events. I just recently started reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, and he wrote that it's basically an open letter to his son, who's a teenager currently. And, you know, after the Trayvon Martin case and George Zimmerman getting acquitted, his son, that was his first experience with race and the impact of something that he thought was clear cut, but quite wasn't. So it's an open letter to his son and how to traverse the world. And so I want to thank you immensely for, you know, being vulnerable and being brave and being, you know, courageous and sharing your experience with us. I mean, it's these types of conversations. And sometimes, you know, and I'll share this and I'll wrap up. Sometimes I absolutely hate and dread being the only person of color in a room full of people. Because I'm always like, am I gonna be the spokesperson for the Black community? Like, and I don't want to be that spokesperson. Like, or it is my interactions with these people when they leave, is that going to be their experience or their takeaway from a Black person? And so, you know, I think that I definitely agree with you. I think that hopefully, in my heart of hearts, I want to believe that this could be the catalyst for the change that's the current situation. But, you know, as a cynic and as an American, I'll wait to see it before I believe it. So thank you so much for your experience. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Vanessa?
Hi, Vanessa. I think you're on mute.
Oh, yeah.
We can
Yes.
hear you.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
I've yet to master this. Your story, Stevan, from when you were younger, your first story about the birthday party. Just when Bonnie brought it up, it really touched me, because my daughter's the same age now, and I think you know, when you're a parent and you're experiencing the world through your kid like that, and you watch them experiencing things like that for the first time, you know, things that we've all gotten very, very used to, just mean things that people can do. And you see how their beautiful, pure worldview begins to break down. And I guess on the back of what we were talking about, like, you know, I feel like one of the most important things that I can do is prepare my daughter, you know, put her out in the world in the best possible way that I can. So we've been talking a lot about, you know, how we talk to our kids. And I guess I'm just wondering for you, my question is, like, at that moment, you know, when you were 5 years old, for as much as you can remember, you know, how did that land with you on the most personal level that you can remember? Like, I want, you know, I was with my daughter at the airport the other day when there was some protests. We were watching it on the screen, some protests, and she said to me, "Mummy, what's going on in the picture?" And I tried to give as simplified a version as I could, you know, without feeling that I would traumatize her, you know, about the protests. But I sort of feel I'm, you know, at what point do I introduce this? Like, at what point is it important to do this without also necessarily skewing her worldview? You know, I want her to be able to go out in the world and experience it herself. You know, I don't want to imbue her necessarily with opinions, but at the same time, I can see the conditioning. You know, where we live here in Silicon Valley, she is, you know, she's on a path here, right? Like, I can, you know, her future set out for her, and I can see how that social conditioning is going to play out. So it just feels like, yeah, it just feels like a.
So your question to me is, you were saying, what was it like for me in that moment? Yeah,
like, as much as you can remember, like, what, you know, so how did that land?
I remember it like it was yesterday, Vanessa. First of all of these stories that I told today and shared, and all of the ones that I haven't, are like they happened yesterday, even if they happened 40 years ago. And I remember Laura's tenderness in trying to let me down easily. I remember her being confused, but yet she was sent on a mandate to explain to me that I wasn't going to be there, or I wasn't allowed to be there, and that she didn't agree with the decision. Because we were friends, we hung out every day on the playground. We were little kids, and we were just having a blast, you know? And I remember being confused, because that was my first experience. I remember not really having I was 5, but having the tools to actually comprehend what I was being told or what it meant. And fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know where I'm going to land on this, it also was the beginning of a lifelong journey of dealing with different situations, whether they were harsh or they were like the mosquito bites that Lizzo talks about that accumulate and can swell up and really cause cumulative damage. one of the things that you said that I'm going to react to is you don't want to skew your daughter's view, but you definitely don't want to overly shelter her either. And I think that's one thing of parents of Black kids, whether they're adopted, because I do know some people in the Washington, D.C. area that are parents of Black kids, and the whole term of woke. Actually, one of them is somebody I work with, and I think you or any parent would be doing your kid a disservice by overly sheltering them. I think having, like with any difficult conversation, I think it's really important or topic to not overwhelm them with information. And like you said, overwhelm them with opinions, and maybe being in touch with when something you're sharing is your personal view, or if it's just facts, like history. Like, there is a fact that someone was murdered in broad daylight by a cop that sparked the riots. That's a fact. That's not an opinion. There are other things that you can share. So I would, if I were a parent, and I'm not, and so I have to be careful, but I would do my best to stay in that lane. Because I think if you veer off the lane of just explaining history like you would explain history, you know, and leaving it at that, I think that's the best, that would, in my view, be the best approach. And even though my mom had to give difficult advice to me, I was no more better equipped than your daughter is at that age to do it. But I remember, even though she teared up, I remember her comforting me and telling me that it was going to be okay, and not to worry about it, because if I remember correctly, she also recognized the fact that Laura was my friend, and that it hurt her too. So.
Thank you. Yeah.
I have a question also. Oh, sorry, Vanessa, do you want to
No,
add anything?
I was just wondering, I'd love to hear as well. Like that she must remember that experience too.
Oh, yes.
Are you still in touch with her?
Oh no, with Laura, no, I don't.
Yeah.
I lost touch with her. I'm in touch with a lot of the other people I talked about.
Yeah. Thank you.
No problem.
Yes, Stefan, I have a question. Well, I didn't know many of the stories, or actually any of the stories that you are talking about today. You just told me when we talked the other day the story about the World Bank, and I didn't know what happened when you came to Spain. I'm very sorry about that. So while I was listening to you, you know, when I knew you in DC, I always thought, well, first of all, that you were an excellent PR person. I always told you that. And I always thought I couldn't imagine you being angry, you know? I'm sure you get angry sometimes, but I couldn't picture you because you're always so pleasant. And when I was listening to you today, I thought all these, you know, very difficult experiences that you had to go through, even when you were a child and you were still making sense of the world. And it seems that you came out of it with no anger. So my question is, what gave you strength? Where did you find the strength? And did you, I mean, this thing about anger, were you angry, or was it something that wasn't very present in your life in general?
I'm a human being, and thank you for the question today, sir. So of course, I feel all emotions. I experience fear, anger, joy, and there were a lot of those situations where I felt deeply angry. And there were situations where in some of my work in personal growth, I've learned where there's two ways to express anger. It's outwardly, which my mom cautioned me as a Black man would be very dangerous, because then I would fit into a stereotype that we are all kind of taught subliminally not to do. So I was always trying to be the good one and the one not to fall into that stereotype. But I've worked on it by expressing myself through channels like this and in other ways, that there are healthy ways to deal with it. The problem, though, that I learned is that anger turned inward is depression. And so when I would take that toxin, or that poison pill, as I like to refer to it, were the things that were the most deeply hurtful for me. And then I was the one left to deal with it. Then some of those toxins I'm still extracting from my body today, July 11th, 2020. And I'll probably still be extracting those toxins for years to come. But the way I do it, and the way that I try to live with intention and impatient optimism, is I meditate. So I don't know much about Buddhism, but that's something I want to learn all about. I was raised as an Episcopalian, but I would like to learn more about Buddhism, because it helps me center and kind of declutter my thought process, and to be more central to my breath and to my being, and to be present, like in this conversation now, or in conversations outside this room after this talk is over, in my work, in every aspect of my life. And resentments are the #1 offender for me and for a lot of people, of total unhappiness. And if I allow myself to be resentful, and I don't forgive, or I don't look for ways to move forward, then I'm not allowing those toxins to be extracted from my body. It's literally poison. And so but I've also had to learn how to be more authentic, meaning that even when I am uncomfortable, that maybe it's okay to speak up, and that it's not okay, because you're actually touching on something that's actually kind of fundamental, which is there are times when you should be outraged, and you should act out and say, this is not okay. And that's the healthy response, not, oh, everything's fine. I didn't just witness that horrific thing. No, something bad just happened. There should be an appropriate response to that. So I've had to kind of recalibrate and realign my thinking in terms of racism, which is the topic we're talking about, to what is and is not acceptable. And a lot of the discussions I found, and I want to be very crystal clear about this, racism, as Robin DiAngelo talks about, is not a good, bad binary. And it's not like someone does something, therefore they're racist and they're a bad person. Because some people do it without even knowing. It's not about impact, it's about the, it's not about the intent, it's about the impact, and that's what I've learned through this process. But I also think that that it's really, really, really important to be authentic and genuine in my responses, and to do it in a way that that is healthy, because there are unhealthy ways to express anger, and I don't want to go to that other side of the pendulum either. So it's funny, we know each other today, so as friends, but also in a professional environment. So of course, in a professional environment, I'm always going to be professional. So even when difficult, but I guess it's just who I am. I think that's probably the simplest answer.
Hi, Stevan. This is Emma. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for sharing your experience and telling your truth. I really appreciate that. And I've been really grateful for people who have been sharing their experience. And also, for example, on social media, I feel that it has completely changed, and we have seen people sharing stories that we haven't before. And that's been a really great way for me to learn. So thank you. And something I'm reflecting on a lot of things that we have talked about in this conversation. But one thing is how you were explaining when you were so young. I think it was the birthday party example, and you were saying you didn't really have the words to put to what was happening and why it was happening. And as a white teacher going into my only second year of teaching, that's something that I'm thinking about with my students who are 8 and 9 years old, working with them to provide a vocabulary of explaining not only what has gone on this past summer, but also the history that we are teaching students and how they can learn from that history and then learn a vocabulary that they can then apply to their everyday lives, especially considering that almost all of my students are students of color. And so I also appreciate the questions from others who have asked what to say to their children. And I appreciate your response of saying that it's always better to just explain and to never hide anything, that children are already taking it at a young age. They're learning bias, and so I don't ever think it's too young for that to be taught and explained and to be in conversation with young children.
Well, thank you, Emma, although it says Lara on the screen.
Oh, yes, I'm on Lara's phone.
So that's my niece who is from Charlottesville, and she's with Teach for America, isn't it? Yeah. In the Dallas area. So I just want to say how much I love and appreciate you and the entire family for your love and support. And I also was very touched by, right after the murder of George Floyd, that when you put together your own list of resources for how people could kind of stand up and to be anti-racist, but also names of organizations that need support. So I thank you for that, and I love you so much. I hope you guys are having a nice time at the beach.
We are, thank you.
Jaya, you have a question?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, Stefan?
Yes.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. And I just want to say first a comment and then a question. The only comment I had was that many years ago, I was hired at a Southern school, a Southern university, and I was they were looking to hire a woman. That was about 25 years ago, and then 2 Black faculty members. I'm still there. The 2 Black faculty members are not. And I think it speaks to your point about the third degree, racism. It was very hard to see that. Not to say that they haven't gone on to do great things, but I think it's there and it's prevalent, and it's hard to see. On the issue of, I think the part, and I don't know if Carter's still there, but I kind of relate to what he was saying about the optimism or lack of in terms of our economic environment and what's going on. And I'm very concerned in the following way, in that the narrative of what's happening is that what I hear people say, that it's not only how much you teach your kids and tell your kids, it's what they see. And what people see is the fact that, so in the southern town that I live in, there's such a big divide, and with the Black community living in a certain area, and as we all know that, and And the story, the narrative is that, well, you know, they're not willing to help themselves and live on handouts. And I've heard this narrative so many times, which of course the video that you posted was so compelling that broke that, that story and that narrative. And I think more people need to understand that what we see is a function of what society has done. And so even if you teach your kids, because I had two boys, and like you, they went to a small private school, the only brown boys, and then we had the token black in that school. And then late in elementary school and then in middle and high school, I moved them across town where it was a predominantly black school. And they had a lot of exposure. And I think that cultural immersion was very important to their development. And now they teach me about not saying words like colorblind because of that. You know what I'm saying? And but the point is that you know, so we can teach them those things, we can expose them, but what they see out there is the fact that you have Blacks living in poor neighborhoods. And the narrative is that they're not helping themselves, which is so not true. And I guess my question then is, how are we going to change that narrative? I mean, that's to me is the bigger, and that's why I empathize with Carter when he says that, well, I'm not so optimistic, or do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for your comment. How do you pronounce your name?
Jay Cherie.
Jay Cherie. Your question is actually at the center of the current debate. And I've personally gotten into uncomfortable conversations, especially in social media, about these type of topics. And one is about Black on Black crime. Oh, well, why isn't, you know, Black Lives Matter shouldn't, you know, focus on police brutality. They should focus on the crime that's happening in themselves. And it's kind of funny, I had to do some education and reading about that. And this is part of my answer to you, is that we don't call mass shootings white on white crime. We don't call the Holocaust white on white crime. Why would we talk about Black on Black crime? It's their mutually exclusive issues. And so the message I have for you is your question was, how do we move or change the narrative? As a communications person, that's a very interesting question, and I'm going to have to really give that a lot of thought. But what my initial response is that I think the best way is to do it through education, like the systemic racism video and similar videos that have been shown, as to what I discussed in my original talk, which is that racism isn't just an individual thing, and it's not something that people can easily get out of. It's just like poverty. I work, you know, in an international organization that deals with economics, and a lot of times they call it the poverty trap. Well, in this case with racism, poverty is on top of the racism. So it's hard to break two traps at once and to access to society. So they need to be educated that you know, we need better funded schools so that the next generation will have access to education. We need to have more diverse workforces so that people can be more economically mobile. We need access to healthcare. What I learned through this COVID pandemic, which this whole thing felt like a horror show for me, was that, you know, although I have a job with insurance and everything, is that to get tested, you needed health insurance. Well, a lot of people don't have access to health insurance, especially if they have it through their job and they just lost their job because people were laid off by the millions. So that's racism when it's institutional and it oppresses an entire people. That's what I would talk about. And I would change the narrative by shedding a very bright light on that, and a consistent light.
Thank you.
Renee? Do you have a question? Christopher?
Hi. Sorry.
Oh, yes.
I had first, thank you for all the discussion. I feel related to it because of my background, which doesn't matter right now. But to some of the questions that have come about children and so forth, I just wanted to offer a little suggestion. It might work for adults, but adults might be more resistant. But certainly in family gatherings, one thing as a parent that I have found has helped me, let's say, educate my children and educate myself through their feedback as well, has been role playing. So Vanessa, with your kid and anyone else who's thinking about the same thing, sometimes you cannot recreate a real experience, and this does not replace being exposed to everything that is occurring and to reading and watching things either on TV or books or anything else. But in my own experience, nothing changes what happens when you feel something. So it might be hard for someone living in a privileged environment or in an environment that is not exposed to many things in a direct contact base to do a little exercise and pretend, like role play, right? I've done this with many topics that are difficult, like religion or others, and it is pretty insightful what happens when you play it honestly and let it happen. But nevertheless, thank you very much for all your stories and for offering this candid viewpoint. It's hard to have these conversations, especially when it is difficult to convey, for example, when you want to learn something from someone else and not come up as judging them for that, which is something I have also found happen, right? So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Christopher?
Yeah, hi, this is Wendy, actually. Hi, Stevan.
Hi.
I wanted to say first, thank you for sharing all of your, well, I know it's not all of your stories, but I think, unfortunately, for a lot of people, for all of this to become real, they need to hear these kind of things. And it's unfortunate that it takes like people like you sharing your traumas and what you've been through for people to understand that it's not one thing that people are upset about, but that it's a daily occurrence that people experience. And I think this is what it's hard. White Fragility talked a lot about like having these conversations. I recommend the book to everyone. We both read it recently, but it's hard having them with family members who at heart are good people and they don't think of themselves as racist, but having, like, I tried to engage my aunt in a conversation recently, and I think she's just one of these people, she doesn't really want to acknowledge like the privilege of being able to say, let's not talk about these things, or let's, you can vote for whoever, it's a level of privilege that is hard to overcome, I think, with older people. And I think that's why it's so important to talk to little kids about it before they're kind of set in their ways. But I know since you mentioned you had conversations with family in Charlottesville and that they were difficult, and I just wondered if you have thoughts on like how to handle those situations when the person you're talking to is, just wants to stay in like their mindset, and doesn't really want to have that like self assessment, I guess, or they don't really want to have those tough conversations. And if you had any ways that you approached that you found successful.
So thank you, Wendy and Christopher. I love you, and I'm so glad that you guys could join today. I think the best advice I can give to your question is not to react through emotion, to take emotion out of it. And trust me, as a Black gay man, that's kind of hard to do at times, because I say that in all sincerity, because it's hard to detach my feelings from reality and what's taking place. But at the same time, in these difficult conversations, and it wasn't like I had several. I mean, my family loves and cares for me,
Right.
but it had to do more with specific, like the history of Confederate monuments, and thinking to myself, well, why are we celebrating the losers? And they lost, and we tried to perpetuate slavery. I personally don't like the idea of taking things down from Thomas Jefferson, who's of course our third president, but also very influential to the birth of this nation. And so I draw the line there with presidents, but I had to detach emotion and speak from a factual base. Yeah. I also needed to find my own voice in terms of the premise of my argument, in terms of, because I think no matter if you're old or young, everybody has integrity. And I think that I also have worked hard to speak in a language, and it takes a lot of work and effort, not just with family, but with friends, even because I have friends that have different political views than I do, is to try to meet them halfway and speak to them in a language that they can understand. Yeah. I think that's probably the best and most important thing that I had to do in those situations.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. Umar, and then Casey.
Hi, Steven.
Hi.
I came across this article. I don't know if people have seen this. This was from the New York Times Magazine.
No, I haven't. I'm gonna write it down.
Yeah, it's called "What Is Owed." It's in 2 weeks ago. It came out, and it was in the Sunday edition. And it talks about reparations and systemic.
I did see the op-ed, yes.
Yeah, so it's about systemic wealth, and that that was interesting. But hearing everybody talk, and I come from a colonialistic country.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents had to migrate from one country to another, and what I kept on hearing was, when I was growing up, that this person or that person, and I saw that with my parents too, was called how should I put this? They used to say that the colonizer left, but they left their mentality behind. So the people who were in charge were still oppressing people, and the oppression kept on going. And what happened was, when it came to me, it was just like, it was all about challenging that, and it was just like having lots of fights and constant disagreements. And so, and the colonialistic mentality can also be understood in another way, which is called the Stockholm Syndrome. That once you are kidnapped, you take on the sort of the thinking of the kidnapper. So it's just like, and what is behind it is like, when, since we're talking about children, we see that this is really a power dynamic. That when people see that this is what happens, I think they did this in the Stanford experiment too, that when somebody sees that this is a powerful way to act, they say, oh, this is a powerful way to act, so I'm going to take that on. And I'm going to start pushing this forward because I don't know any other way. And it takes really a lot of time to reflect back and see that what you have been told, a lot of it has to, like you're saying, it's like you're taking in all these. This is another form of toxicity that we all take in. And for me, Just I've taken a lot of toxicity. I'm constantly clearing it out, saying no, this is not how it is. And when I apply it in practical life, it doesn't work. And so this is not working. What works then? Then I have to go and look for what works. And it is something that I've come to understand that it is a lifelong effort to work on this mentality and to get rid of this mentality. And we're all given this mentality. And this I've seen with my, I used to work at Best Buy, and they deliberately not promote African Americans. They would not deliberately promote African Americans. They would deliberately, instead of promoting them, they demoted people. And it was just the strangest thing that I saw. And, you know, I would say things to them. It's like, you're just doing this. They would do this with African-American men and with Latino women. They would deliberately go ahead and demote them. And these were the hardest working people. They would give their all. They would come in early. They would leave late. And it was just like, and they were saying to me, why do you care? What difference does it make to you? And no,
we should all care.
Huh?
We should all care.
Like, to me, it was just like, you know, why do you have to create this example? Because they were creating an example for everybody. People who were being hired and people who were in the upper management. I was constantly seeing this. And there were other companies that I worked for. And I've seen the same thing happen, that they would take in an African-American manager or a black manager, and then they would have him clean everything up, the mess that had been left behind with somebody, and then they would fire him and not promote him. And I started to understand it was like if you can't move upward, you move outward, and that was it. But you know, and it does a very strange thing to people's psyche. It says that you do not deserve, you do not belong. And this is the problem that I keep seeing underneath all of this, is there is a certain mentality that is constantly being reinforced over and over again, whether it's through wealth, whether it's through jobs, whether it's through what police does to people. But this is such a dangerous thing that we're doing, and this is what we need to stand up against. I have to leave the company because I cannot stand that anymore.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Stevan, so many questions. I hope you have a few more minutes. We have three more people, Casey, then Mark, and afterwards, Ria.
And Lenny put something in the chat too.
Oh yeah, and Lenny too, yes. So maybe Casey, he's had his hand up for a while.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm calling from halfway across the nation. I used to go to Kannon. Just a little about me. When people see me, they probably see an Asian American or maybe just an Asian. But I see myself as a citizen of the world because my parents traveled extensively when I was growing up, and I just tagged along. I'm currently part of a reparations group that started a year ago, and I guess I'm circling back to the question around how to talk to children about race and racism. I heard a very informative program on NPR by Jason Reynolds. He's the National Ambassador for Young People. He's a writer. He's a Black writer, and he has written several books that are addresses this for young people. So, and then he talked about his own experience, and that as to children, if we love them, we need to tell them the truth, and to help the children learn how to process it. the race, 5, 6 year old. I mean, I think he gave an example of a first grader who came home after a documentary they saw for kids about race or just history, how horrible it was. And the kid came back and said, I'm so glad I'm white. And the mother was shocked, like, what now? How do I follow this up? And I can't remember whether he offered this. I can't remember exactly, but the gist of it is he says, maybe help the child so what do you think a Black child will feel? Or maybe the child offered, I feel so bad for the Black child. So help the child process it at their level. Right? They would say, I'm sad, whatever it is. And then they would say, that's why we're going to the protest, whatnot. So for people with young children, there are books around. The librarians may have some good books, but definitely Jason Reynolds, he has written several books for young adults. This would be older children, but one may draw inferences from those stories. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark, and then
I get to
I think you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Stevan, thanks for sharing all the stories. I think I knew most of them, but they're always still very difficult to hear even after 15 and a half years. So thanks for sharing. I know it's not always easy to doing so. I just want to share a personal experience with the group. Many years ago when I lived in Atlanta, I was dating an African-American man and went to a party at his house where most of his friends were African-American. I got there and realized I was one of probably half a dozen white men in the party. And although most of the people at the party were very nice and welcoming to me, and I was actually new to Atlanta, I felt there was a certain amount of people that did not want me there because I was white. And it finally dawned on me in my 30s how it feels for most Black people to be around a lot of white people who felt like the minority and probably a lot of times not feel welcomed. And so it took me almost till 32 years old to experience something like that. And I think it's an experience most white people will never, experience in their life, but really need to really understand racism and how it feels to be the minority and not be welcomed. So, it was really eye-opening for me. And so I try to take that experience with me everywhere I go. So, thanks.
Thank you. Ria?
Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi. First off, we want Stevan. We really liked what you said about internalized anger being a depression a while back. That was really insightful. We'll have to think about that some more and talk about it. But there's been a lot of questions about what to tell kids, and we're parents of 2 girls, almost teenagers. But I also immigrated from the Philippines when I was 11 to Sacramento, California. And the perspective I try to tell Travis is that the Bay Area is not as diverse as people like to present themselves, because I think Vanessa asked a question if you were still friends with that girl that couldn't invite you to her birthday party. And I was making a comment to Travis that, you probably changed that girl's life because of your friendship. She's gonna grow up having a better perspective than her parents. She would have been, I don't know if she's still racist, but I don't think she would be, because she had a good friend growing up And that's what I try to tell Travis. When I immigrated to Sacramento as a 6th grader, it's so diverse there that my first friends were Black. And I think that experience really changed me. And that's something I always talk about, my kids not experiencing. And so that's the comment to the parents that, I think just being, having your kids play with other Black kids and it not being any big deal, like there doesn't even need to be a commentary, because you could develop friendships, and I think that would change the kids and how they grow up. So I wish I had a an idea how to make the Bay Area more integrated, but but that's just a comment that I think as parents, if we could just have it doesn't have to be a talk, because I think a lot of times we try to tell our kids to tell them something about racism, but it doesn't stick with them as much as actually being around other people of color. And another thing, they are exposed to other people of color. They're just not exposed to other Black people in Mountain View, for example. But I think that's probably, that's something important as well. But especially with the way Black people are so much more discriminated against, I think it's important for kids to have those type of experiences. So.
Thank you, very insightful, thank you. And to Mark as well, obviously.
And Lini's been waiting for a while. Thank you, Lini.
Thank you, Stefan, for your wisdom. My question is, this is a long fight. How can we make political commitments that will really matter? And so what are the 2 or 3 priorities that you would say we should be campaigning for?
Well, thank you, Lenny, and I saw you, I think you were the one that posted a question in the chat. It can be overwhelming when you think about it in a comprehensive way, because racism, at least in my view, has affected every aspect of my life. So I like your question because I think it will cause all of us to focus. And for me, I think the 3 areas that will make the biggest difference for kids that are being born today would be to address what ignited the protests, which is the issue of police brutality. It's an issue in its own right. And when I did some reading, I saw that the FBI released some information about a phenomenon of white supremacists infiltrating law enforcement. And when I did some digging, I read that the FBI has been doing work on this since 2006. And I thought to myself, wow, Comey gave a speech in 2016 about it. And then they had been doing this research. So I'm thinking, well, why don't I know about this? So to have journalists uncover that kind of information, an important topic, is because I'm not a big proponent of defunding the police, because it's obviously a necessary thing that we need in society. However, I do feel personally that when I did some more digging that I can't remember if it was the National Federation of Police or something, I have to go back and look it up, the exact title, but there are about 800,000 police in the United States, or I'm sorry, 850,000 if I remember correctly. And I read a report that there are 85,000 misconduct cases of police that are shuffled from one precinct to another. that had to do not all with racism, but they had to do with driving under the influence. They had to do with domestic violence or other things. And basically, they're kind of a sheltered or protected class. And I think we need to have a lot more transparency about that. And that we need to, just like you have doctors and pilots, you need to have a kind of a minimum standards for what is acceptable and to what is required to be a police officer. So I think some people refer to it, and I need to do more research about the prison, the school to prison pipeline, and the whole fact of the judicial system and the police system has been oppressive and is basically the definition of racism that is continuing to oppress Black people in America. So I think we need to take a hard look at that. The other thing that I think Mary Beth, who posted in the chat, I think we need to aggressively tackle disparities and inequalities and equities in health, because I think that if people don't have access to health, or if I may be misquoting, but I believe it's the number one or one of the number one reasons for bankruptcies in America, that even if you are healthy and then one day you come up with a catastrophic illness, you can be pushed into poverty. And before you can get social assistance, you have to be poor. So you literally have to spend down all of your resources. Well, there's something wrong with that. And so I don't have the answer. I'm not a health specialist, but I feel that fundamentally, and just for the core values of this country and what we were founded on, need to address that. And then finally, I would say, I don't know if it would be an education or housing or if they're linked, but I feel that, like the video on systemic racism, I feel like that we need to address and make sure there's a difference, and I've also learned this, there's a difference between the word equality and equity. And I think that everyone needs to have equal access to housing and education. I'm not saying that the government needs to pay for that. I'm not the spokesperson for this, but I do think that there's some issues that need to be addressed there. I think that until we address 2 or 3 key pillars of what holds racism in place, we will not, 20 or 30 or 50 years from now, we will not see the progress that I think all of us would expect to see.
Thank you, Stevan. Lots of questions.
Yes, so I don't know, because I think originally this was going to be 90 minutes, and but there's been a lot of interest. So I don't know if you just want me to say some parting words and kind of wrap up now, or what you would like to do.
Thank you very much for the extra time, and thank you everybody who asked questions. So I think, yeah, some parting words.
So one of the things that I want to make sure that is crystal clear is that the discussion about racism is uncomfortable for everybody. And I think that we need to have more conversations like this, not fewer. And we all need to do a lot more work to educate ourselves about the topics at hand, some of the ones I just mentioned in my last answer. And really find ways to work together. I think people need to do the work, educate themselves, and then ask tough questions with people who are family or friends or coworkers. But one of the most important things I think that we all need to do in terms of being bystanders, whether anybody's looking or not, is to address racism when it's a safe place to do so. I don't want someone to put themselves in a difficult or unsafe place, but I think because only when we accept that this is a true phenomenon and not a figment of our imagination, that can we address it, especially because racism is institutional. We shouldn't accept the status quo. I think we should definitely have these difficult conversations with friends and family, and only then can we really move forward as a society. And I'm not just talking about the United States of America, by the way. I'm talking about globally, because this is why one of the things that I think that really left a big impression on me and my evolution in thinking is that there were protests about Black Lives Matter in Latin America, in Serbia, in Tokyo, in you know, people in Lebanon and Africa were showing solidarity. So this is a really fundamental issue that needs to be addressed everywhere. So thank you very much, Teresa, for inviting me, and I hope that this was an insightful and good conversation to have. And thanks also to your organization for making this happen.
Yeah, and Stevan, I didn't get the chance to introduce you at the beginning, Lester Kay. He's our teacher and the abbot at Kannon, the center that we all belong to.
Yes, thank you. Namaste.
Thank you, everybody.